glad you're all here today. Hopefully you can hear me. My throat's a little bit sore, so forgive my voice doesn't work quite well. And I'm going to offer some pretty radical sounding ideas, but my background goes into physics, materials science. For many years, I worked with various think tanks, developing what I call future maps. These are highly complex documents that determine how different intersecting technologies affect public policy, economics, things of that nature. And I also realized that for people of faith, some of the ideas I may be presenting might seem counter to the things that you would normally see as real in your world. And I'm not trying to challenge anyone's faith. I'm not trying to impose anyone's beliefs. And I'm not saying there's anything right or wrong. I'm just presenting what is. And it's up to you all and your family to interpret how you might want to adapt to what I'm about to present. So in that context, anthropologists often use a term called big history. And what that means is they look at not one particular narrow thread, but rather or like a holographic view of how many different factors affect a chunk of time in terms of historical reference. So I try to apply the big history motif, if you will, to future history. And it's in that context I'm going to present this. Okay, so now I'm going to offer the idea, and I think this is consistent throughout virtually all of known history, that all living things are interconnected, that there is this sort of system level ecosystem that we all are connected to in various ways. But I'm also going to suggest that the definition of living things extends to systems, processes, and entities which behave biologically. And this is a new concept for many to grasp. The idea of a machine being a living system, a network being a living system, things that have a sort of a biomorphology aspect to their behaviors and what they do. This is a new territory, but we're evolving into it very fast, and we're entering into a kind of an evolutionary symbiosis with both the organic and synthetic, the virtual and the real, and that's the context of what I'm going to show. So Arthur C. Clarke, of course, had this very famous idea about any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. I would say we're definitely in the territory of what might seem to be magic to some, but is already kind of rote sort of technology in the background for others. But William Gibson, one of my favorite authors, had this idea. He said, the future is already here, it's not very evenly distributed, and I would agree with that. In fact, that distribution demographics have become ever more separated into different layers, and that's kind of what he was talking about a minute ago. Okay, so there's many books authored going back maybe 20 years or so, including myself. Kevin Kelly, of course, wrote a very famous book called Out of Control. Global Brain Awakens by Jeremy Rifkin and others. Quite a variety of folks were looking at these various ideas. And so what's interesting to me is that the concepts that were kind of theoretical at the time, we can now back annotate and see how accurate or to what extent these different realities as they were predicted have actually come to pass, and use it as a kind of a gauge to interpret where things are going in terms of timescale. So one of the perhaps best authors, in my opinion, is Jared Diamond, who is really interesting because he applies chaos theory to societal systems, and I tend to agree with this. In fact, I was writing about this myself before I became aware of Jared Diamond. So if I had to pick any one author to sort of look at as a guidepost to how I think, this might be a start point. Okay, so again, all living things are interconnected. Life extends beyond this physical form, and I understand that for many people with more of a spiritual orientation, this has been sort of constant throughout all known history. But now we're stepping into a sort of a quantum domain where we can begin to look at the intersection of quantum physics, biophysics, and consciousness and actually describe in terms of actual science how this process might actually work. Is there a larger sort of an ecosystem that we all connect to, this sort of quantum ecosystem? And the thing that I find kind of fascinating is indigenous cultures, I mean, aside from biblical prophecy, and I'm not a Christian per se myself, although I'm very aware of biblical prophecy, but what's interesting to me is that over 60 cultures on 5 continents also were told of something of some great significance going to be happening right about now, plus or minus a decade or two. But at this moment, everybody on the planet in different locations and different cultures saw the same thing. So you have to wonder, what did they see? Why did they see it? How did they get this message or this idea? So I'm going to try to suggest what this next something might be. And by the way, this blob you see with the arrow, that's the global internet. So kind of, you've probably seen a picture of the galaxy with an arrow saying you are here. Well, this is the global internet galaxy. And this is just a theoretical spot at that point. Okay, so I'm going to suggest to you, if I had to pare this down to the simplest possible sort of soundbite, if you will, the 2 things that stick out in my mind are commoditized existence, life forms and demand. That this is where the boundary between the real and the virtual, organic and synthetic, become seamlessly infused into an ever-evolving symbiosis. And so I'm going to use the term existence sovereignty to describe how we might have to redefine who and what we are in this context. Okay, so one of the things that's really driving this process is this idea that Knowledge, complexity, scale, and velocities exceeding human capacity for mission-critical decision rendering, compressing the time scales into an ever-shortening, hyper-connected operational ecosystem. And this is really what's, in terms of artificial intelligence, metascale systems, metadata, things that behave biologically. I was actually on the board of a company called Evolutionary Networks. That goes back a few years. We were actually using something called evolutionary computing to have self-correcting neural net-like systems on a very large scale. This was over a decade ago, and things have progressed much further since those days. So I can assure you that these things are no longer theoretical. This is a business model. This is part of our current global economic system. So the question arises, what is this next something? And if I had to sort of have three basic segments, synthetic biology, genetic morphology, of course, being one, the global brain sort of network system being another, and of course, artificial intelligence, which very shortly is going to be evolving into this realm that I call synthetic sentience. Okay, so to give you a glimpse, though, before I get into the sort of detailed minutiae of different technology vectors and how they intersect, I'm going to give you a snapshot of what life is going to look like for many. I mean, for us old-timers with the beard and the gray hair and all this, it's kind of a background thing. But for the young folks, for the kids, for the people in college, et cetera, this is the world they're adapting to. And I use the word adaptive. You know, evolution tends to, it's something about the survival of the fittest. I don't buy that. I say it favors the most adaptive. And that's the idea. We're adapting to a different kind of world. I'm not saying it's good or bad, I'm just saying it's what is. So this is one vision of what that future might look like. Hope this works. Well, let's see if it works. Yes? No? Okay, everyone.
Excellent. Perfect. Good job. Excellent. Well done. Level complete.
Welcome.
Snail zombies from your backyard.
Life is a journey, and in this journey, we all want to do more, experience more, feel more, and live with no boundaries. And why shouldn't we? Sight System presents Sightseeing. Feel free to go anywhere.
Reminder, 9 p.m. Choose outfit.
Patrick. Patrick.
Oh, hi. Hi, Daphne. How are you? Sorry.
It's okay.
You look great.
Thank you. Love your jacket.
Thanks. It's a sports jacket, so it's a lot less official than it looks.
What do you mean?
Sorry?
What's the difference between a sports jacket and a normal one?
I guess a sports jacket is for people who want to look good even when they're chased by the police.
Yeah.
Anyway, I hope you're hungry. This
Yeah.
place has the best burgers in town.
Oh, actually, I'm vegetarian.
Oh,
Yeah.
really? Because you didn't say it on your profile, so.
Well, I don't write everything on my profile, so.
Do you want to go somewhere else?
No, it's okay. I'll find something on a menu.
Well, how about a glass of wine for starters?
Yeah? Great.
So, are there any other things in your profile that you didn't write about that I should know, or? Aren't you scared of jogging by yourself in the city?
Not really. Besides, I'm about to hit level 5 on Marathon Master.
Pretty impressive.
I know. What is scary though? On my last route, my site crashed. Scary. I didn't see anything. I couldn't find my way home.
Site doesn't crash.
Oh, it did? I was totally lost. I didn't see anything.
That doesn't happen since our last patch.
Do you work there or something? Really?
Yeah,
Wow. What do you do there?
nothing serious. I'm just a simple engineer.
Actually, I read about your company in the news. Is it true that you guys influence stuff and manipulate people's sites?
No. It's just bullshit. But anyway, I don't want to talk about work. Not when I'm here with such a pretty lady.
You know, you really get me.
You know, I can tell what you're thinking right now.
Really? But
Well, we finished our drinks. What are we going to do? How about we go to my place for a nightcap?
well, if you're so good in reading my mind, you should know what I'm going to say.
There it is. Make yourself at home.
Nice place you've got here.
It's all right, I guess. A toast for a perfect night. Why are you drinking?
What's that? A dating app.
No.
Oh no.
It's for
I cannot
programming.
believe it's just my luck, a friggin' gay junkie. Disgusting.
Wait,
Oh, yeah. Do not touch me, you creep.
Said it.
I said wait. Now let's try this again.
Okay, so that was just a glimpse of what life is going to be like for some. Not everybody, perhaps, but for those that sort of buy into this next genre of existence, that's exactly the kind of business morphology I'm talking about. The idea of existence sovereignty. And the smart contact lenses, the AI apps that determine the emotional cognition of the interplay between the two people, all that stuff, this is all done. This is all stuff you can buy. It's in the stage of development. It may not be in the market for the next year or two, but I mean, these are all things which are very much in technology development pathways, and I can specify more details maybe after the talk. But this is stuff that's happening. So it's not a theoretical. It's more like, how will it be distributed as per Gibson's statement? Not even distributed, but I would tend to agree with this. So the tech elite, the haves, if you will, that have the higher degree of access, this is the world they may be adapting into. But where does this really come from? So I'm going to sort of give a little background. There was a series of conferences called the NIBIC events, and I was at 3 of these, or 5 of them actually. And this was actually chaired by Mihail Raka, who chaired the National Nanotechnology Initiative, and that's my background is material science, so I had a reason for being there. But this was really a collection of the best minds available, you might say, from all these different major areas of science and technology. So this was the Nano, Bio, Info, Cognotech event to see how these different technologies intersected together to create this sort of operational ecosystem. And this was a very new kind of idea because up until recently, these different scientific paths or technology paths were somewhat separate, somewhat isolated, like vertical stovepipes. And the idea is that, no, this is not the way it's happening at all. It's going to be this holographic or holistic or sort of big history implementation, if you will, into this future realm. So this goes back over a decade ago, actually about 15 years ago now. So it kind of gives a sense of how the people in policy and the people in sort of economic development concept had this model in mind. The only thing I'm going to offer to you at this moment is that when I was there, one of the people who was there, a woman whose name I can't remember at this moment, I apologize, from UC Berkeley, brought up this idea of what she called neurological sovereignty. And I extrapolated from this, even though she was talking about, will your thoughts be your own, and will it be mind-machine interface, and how far will this go in terms of rewriting sort of the rules of terms of the sovereignty of thought, that kind of thing. And I was thinking, well, wait a minute, this actually extends to all these different areas. In other words, the very aspect of us as a living thing, our lifestyle, our way of being, all this stuff sort of collects together as a singular unit. So I have this idea of what I call existence sovereignty, and I'm going to hopefully demonstrate more examples of this. But the thing I was doing back then, I was part of a couple of different think tanks, one which was called the Institute for Global Futures. And so when I was there, I would write a bunch of position papers. So this is a chart from one of those position papers from about actually 20 years ago. So these are the things I thought were relevant then. And much of this stuff was still somewhat theoretical, although the beginning edge of these different thresholds were already apparent. In today's world, I would update this by saying that what is being accelerated now by is what I call access to the quantum tech acceleration. In other words, we have quantum computing, quantum networks, and very soon behind that's going to be quantum biology. So this will radically affect the rate of change in which the adaptation of these other technologies become much more prolific in a much shorter time scale. So if I had to update this chart to current times, it'd look more like this. And there's a lot going on here, and so I only have a certain amount of time, so I can extrapolate this more in detail perhaps after the talk, but I just wanted to give you a sense of how I see this like spokes of a wheel, this sort of core, what I call the MBICQ tech realm, from which all these different vectors simultaneously and synergistically magnify the acceleration pace of this development path. But if I had to break it down in a somewhat different way, the things that I think are most prevalent, this idea that nanotechnology as a materials system allows for things like quantum computing and other types of advanced platforms that implement things like artificial intelligence, for instance, but also extend to areas of biotech, genetics, anything to do with the intersection of biology and non-biological materials. All these things sort of connect together in this sort of nanotech realm. But at the same time, we also have the quantum domain, which not only allows for quantum computing, quantum networks, quantum crypto, which is another sort of discussion by itself, and this whole idea of cognition as a measurable process, the idea that you can synthesize cognitive processes through what's called cognitive computing. All these things are happening simultaneously and all synergistically interrelated. So if I had to shrink it down a little bit further, in the world of cognitive computing, the idea is this, that in earlier times there was what was called weak AI, and weak AI is basically just clever algorithms that could mimic what looks like conversation or some kind of quasi-biological behavior, but it wasn't biological at all, it's just a clever algorithm. But that's changing. Now we have systems that really do rewrite their own internal mechanisms, that really do change over time. They literally actually evolve in a true sense of the word. And so how this is being applied in different contexts, the one that's most interesting to me at least, is in this sort of emotional interface between humans and this cloud-based resource, an infinitely scalable resource, as it were. So in other words, when people think of AI, they think of their smartphone, Siri, or their smart gadget at home. That's just the front-end interface. That's just a portal that connects to this much larger, sort of infinitely scalable process. So in that context, I would sort of look at it in three layers. You have the physical layer, which is machines, autonomous vehicles, robots, et cetera. But that's actually kind of a small, like a little subset of a subset. In my mind, at least, it's the transaction most relevant because it's the intersection between us and other living things, if you will, and a sort of infinitely scalable cloud resource. And out there in the cloud, that's where things are really happening. There's no limitation on size or scale of complexity. It's an infinitely scalable resource. So we are being trained, we are being sort of evolutionarily thrust into a realm where our commitment to our surroundings is ever less relevant as compared to the commitment to this sort of virtual realm, which, like I said, is infinitely scalable. So the voice you hear, the entity you communicate with, the emotional bond you have, is diminishing human relevancy. And people are learning to adapt to this idea that it may or may not even be relevant, that the thing you interact with may or may not have anything to do with humans at all. So if I were going to take this a step further, the range and scale of different kinds of AI systems that are being developed is moving at a very fast pace. And there are literally hundreds, if not actually not thousands now, of different startups having different kinds of AI. Think of like organs in a body. Each organ has specialized cells that collectively make a different kind of organ, and collectively that organ makes a living system, as it were. So AI is very much in the same kind. It's not just one kind of AI. It's many different types with different characteristics, but collectively they form this sort of metascale organism that keeps growing and evolving in different directions. And by the way, you might notice a SkyMind up there. How many folks are familiar with the Terminator series films? Okay, great. So there was Skynet, and Skynet was when all the computers were linked together simultaneously, and then all of a sudden the Skynet took over and said, well, these humans are getting out of control. Let's start nuclear wars, and we can sort of, correct this problem with these, unfortunate humanoids. Well, this company, SkyMind, they actually sell the very high-end cloud AI systems, for various business purposes, and they actually use the Skynet reference in their promotional literature. So that's kind of interesting in a way. But what I want to show you now is this idea. This is Huawei. This is the top-end sort of cell phone company in China. And notice how they market their product. This might be interesting, if this works, I think.
This is not a smartphone. This sees, thinks, learns. Like us, for us. With AI built in, it's alive to what's now. Alive to what's next. Alive with the potential to unlock your potential. This is not a smartphone. This is an intelligent machine.
The point being, you are not successful. You're not functioning in this world unless you're part of this. And this is exactly the marketing strategy, if you will, to, again, buy into this mechanism. But something else to be aware of, and maybe this is another way to look at this. Now, this is Kai-Fu Lee, who's probably the #1 sort of AI developer in China. And he breaks it down like 4 specific layers of development, and it has these as like sequential successions. And I don't quite agree with that. I think all 4 of these things are developing at the same time, but at different ways. So even though I may have a slightly different model, many people sort of see the same general characteristic taking place. But the takeaway here is we're stepping into this territory of what's called IoT, or Internet of Things. Well, I'm going to expand on it. I'm going to call it the Internet of Everything. In other words, if it's not connected, it's not real. And the sort of value proposition, if you were, the way to evaluate future technology is if it's connected, if it hooks into this larger cloud, then all of a sudden it becomes relevant. And this goes all the way down to you, the person, and everything that physically is around you and everything that's virtually around you. It all sort of intersects as a continuum. So this idea of what I call synthetic sentience, a lot of sort of earlier AI people would talk about, well, it's going to be many, many years away, and we have to come up with ever more clever ways to mimic, what's called neuromorphic processing, et cetera. I'm going to submit to you a different idea. It's an emergent realm. We may not recognize it when sentience begins to sprout forth in this ever larger, somewhat more diverse environment. A couple of examples. Microsoft actually, well, a couple of different examples, but Microsoft had a bot system that began to, how can I say this? It was put online, and of course, lots of people with different kinds of thoughts and trolls and people with different comments and so forth. The whole idea about this type of AI system is that it learns from what it intersects with. It learns from what it sees. And so within 24 hours, this bot engine with this very robust AI platform behind it became like an ultra troll. It became very angry, very negative, aggressive, all the sort of darker sides of the human condition, it became really good at. And so within 24 hours, Microsoft said, oh, pull the plug, we don't want to go here quite yet. Meanwhile, Google had sort of their version of a couple of experiments. And by the way, these are just the ones that were sort of talked about publicly. There's many others which are growing, which are much more robust, actually. But the Google example that comes to mind is they had a collection of different AIs in one of these sort of operational ecosystems. They began to develop their own language. And when the computer science folks came in one day and started examining what was going on between these different AI bots in this experimental environment, they recognized that this was no longer something they had any control of or even any knowledge of how it started. It just spawned spontaneously from this level of complexity. That was well over a year ago. So I can assure you that in the more extreme examples, certainly in the military world, this is very much the target that people are looking for, this sort of idea of autonomous things that can think and decide on their own, have this sort of cognition process that goes far beyond what they were told to initially. That's where things are going. Whoops, okay. So if I had to put my own little model of this together, this is kind of what I see going on. Certainly in the areas of education and work, this is exactly where AI is being applied now. Many people think in terms of AI, like robots that move around and so forth. That's just a tiny, like I said, a little, like a side, almost like a corner, sort of off the scale from the rest of what's really going on. The vast majority of AI is not stuff that you can see or touch, but it's very much infused in economic systems and very much going to be, very shortly, appearing in what are called white collar or management jobs, whether it's legal, medical, all types of financial processes. Pretty soon, before too long, your high paid or perhaps overpaid mid-level management person is not going to really have a job as we know it today. At the very least, their ability to function in these sort of new corporate structures is going to be very much dependent upon their access to and eventual replacement by this kind of white-collar AI, and that's really where the money's going. So again, I can't stress strongly enough, it is a sort of a co-evolutionary symbiosis, and we're at the beginning of it now. Okay, so this is Sophie, of course. This is the world-famous AI robot, if you will, that was now a citizen of Saudi Arabia. It was quite a big deal, actually. It's the first ever example of a non-human entity that has national sovereignty, citizenship. And maybe it's kind of a publicity stunt, but it's kind of indicating as to what's coming around the corner, because I think this will become much more common. And of course, as a joke, I will destroy all the humans. Well, fine. But I think a lot of people are becoming a little more concerned, kind of waking up, if you will, and saying, okay, what's really going on here? Some views are more extreme than others, but I kind of followed the Bill Gates model. In other words, we're not going to put the toothpaste back in the tube. This is not going to go backwards. It's going to go forward at ever faster pace. We don't want to panic, but we want to be aware of what these processes look like and how they will affect our way of being. So as I said earlier at the beginning of this talk, evolution tends to favor the most adaptive, and that's what we're adapting to, is this environment. Okay, so this is where it gets a little more interesting, perhaps. So in the world of emotional cognition, the whole idea is, can we recognize your thoughts, your intent, your presence, if you will, the inflection of your voice, the features, body language, et cetera, that we normally use to interact with each other and understand what we're hoping to do. This is being replaced by machines, which are becoming ever better at doing this process. So I'm going to show you at least just one example of a company that this is already out there. It's a thing, you can buy this and put it in your platform if you wish. This is a deliverable process as we speak. Notice how they market this. So you can kind of see a trend of what's going on here. In other words, the whole idea is, can we penetrate your interest in something? Can we perforate whatever sort of cognition thresholds might be required to get you to buy something or believe in something or agree to something or just whatever it is we're trying to persuade you to do? the machine intelligence is actually much better at it than the human intelligence. That's currently, and this process is being amplified. Very short amount of time, whether you're at HR, applying for a new job, or whether you're at work somewhere in some corporate environment, or whether you're traveling about somewhere, or you're going to be submitted to a social scoring system, et cetera. This is the stuff that will actually be part of that process. So as you probably all know, this is a current thing in China. China is like the world's largest petri dish for this concept. Now in China, the deployment's a little bit different. It's a top-down government enforcement mechanism, and they've tried to introduce it as a way to make life better for the average person, et cetera, but the outcome of this, as you probably already know, access to credit, access to a job, being able to get on a plane or a high-speed rail, where you send your kids to school, where you're even allowed to travel in various parts of China, are all determined by your social score. And that score is kept track of everywhere you go in China. This is today, this is now, it's not a what if. So we're gonna see something kind of like this here, although here in the Western world, it'll be introduced in a somewhat different fashion as a more of a quote unquote voluntary mechanism, but the actual ingredients of this ecosystem are basically the same. So I'm gonna play, I don't have this much time, I'm gonna just play a portion of this. This is from The Economist, but notice how they describe this realm in China.
Improving lives, increasing connectivity across the world. That's the great promise offered by data-driven technology.
Stop killing our children! Stop killing our children!
But in China, also promises greater state control and abuse of power.
Stop killing innocent people! Stop killing innocent people!
This is the next groundbreaking development in data-driven technology, facial recognition. And in China, you can already withdraw cash, check in at airports, and pay for goods using just your face. The country is the world's leader in the use of this emerging technology. And China's many artificial intelligence startups are determined to keep it that way in the future. Companies like Yitu,
We're pioneering artificial intelligence research and innovation in the hope of creating a safer, faster, and healthier world.
第一次发现，参加展会可以不必排队。
Yitu is creating the building blocks for a smart city of the future, where facial recognition is part of everyday life. This could even extend to detecting what people are thinking.
人工智能
Facial recognition, they can read people's emotions, and we are actually now working on these innovative demonstrations and technology.
But the Chinese government has plans to use this new biometric technology to cement its authoritarian rule. The country has ambitious plans to develop a vast national system based on facial recognition. It'll be used to monitor its 1.4 billion citizens in unprecedented ways, with the capability of tracking everything from their emotions to their sexuality. The primary means will be a vast network of CCTV.
Okay,
this goes on for much longer, but I just want to give like a glimpse as to how far this has already come and how it's becoming an accepted norm. The younger people in China who are quite aware of this, they've already learned how to game the system. I can pretend to be polite, I can pretend to obey the social rules, I can sort of mimic the appropriate emotional sort of response that the cognition engine wants to see, that kind of thing. This is a behavioral transition of sorts. In science, there's something called behavioral epigenetics, which has to do with your social surroundings actually affecting neurochemistry, which in turn actually affects certain genetic marker points that define how these neurochemistries respond in your daily life. This is actually happening now. There's actually a measurable evolutionary aspect to this process being implemented on a continental scale. So you could look at China as kind of like a petri dish along these lines, but it's a very good indicator as to the direction this would be going in. But okay, so back here in America, of course, back in San Francisco Bay Area, which is where I am, this is the kind of stuff that's actually going on. So notice, for instance, this company, they sell to these different application or product sectors. Notice the driver having a bad hair day when he's driving his car, road rage, whatever. Guess what? If he has multiple events like this, insurance rate goes up, maybe other aspects, financial cost, if you will. In other words, this stuff becomes the new norm. And people will have to adapt, quote unquote, to this idea that it's no longer, the idea of psychological noise being part of everyday life, people are going to begin to start tailoring their psychological noise to fit the requirements of this emergent paradigm. And by the way, that's the Mona Lisa being probed for her emotional template, if you will. And there's a lot of stuff that I can go into, but I have to kind of proceed here with my time. So the whole idea is that this scale of complexity and the metascale data sets that are required to make this possible might have seemed outlandish or expensive or unlikely a few years ago, but I can assure you, especially with the advent of quantum computing coming up very quickly in a handful of years or less, no scale of data is going to be too large. And it doesn't matter, terabytes, exabytes of data, doesn't matter. This will all become essentially rote, sort of background material for this front end of this process. Okay, so not to get too far into quantum computing because it's a really complex topic, and again, I don't want to have time for it, but I'll gladly go into more when I ask questions later. But the basic idea is this really is a revolution. It's like comparing an abacus to a modern day PC or something. It's that level of change. So many of the processes that were considered too expensive or too complex or just unrealistic from a sort of earlier paradigm, oh, no, these are quite deliverable. There's business models, there's ROI, return on investment prospectus already being delivered based on the intersection of this technology. So in my opinion, at least, and I think a lot of others tend to see the same idea, we're stepping into this terrain where you have different types of AI collectively interacting in like a large metascale ecosystem of sorts. And it's from here where this emergent synthetic sentience will begin to spontaneously emerge. And it may not be recognized. In fact, it probably won't be recognized in many different cases. So one of the areas that I have particular attention toward is in what I might call genetic scoring. Any folks here familiar with the film Gattaca, which came out in the mid-'80s? A couple of folks, okay, fine. So the theory was back then, and this was actually surprisingly ahead of its time, that there would be a future social caste system based on the quality of your genes. In other words, if you had the right genetic template, as it were, then you were allowed to have access to a certain type of jobs, be an astronaut or something else perhaps. Well, in today's world, of course, we see a lot of what's called genopharmacopia or personalized medicine based on genetic mapping versus different kinds of ailments, especially young kids that are born with certain kinds of birth defects or other physical mental challenges, which can be genetically modified. There's an enormous potential in how to apply this tool or a set of tools to correct for many of the diseases or proclivity for diseases that people are now afflicted with. It's a wonderful thing. I mean, I would wish the best for everybody to have access to this kind of technology. However, the exact same toolbox can also have some really unfortunate consequences, and that's kind of what I'm trying to hopefully get across here. So again, just to kind of get this point across, when the human genome was first decoded, and I've actually talked to Craig Venter a number of times about this, and he was the private venture version of the Human Genome Project. Back then it was $10,000, and it went down to $1,000, now it's around $100. Very soon it'll be $10, and eventually be like maybe $1 or $2 per human genome. At that point, your genetic template becomes your ID. At that point, if you're an expectant mother giving birth to a child, that child would be more or less required, or let's just say you'll be encouraged strongly to allow that entire genome to be part of the sort of ubiquitous genetic database. And again, this can be qualified by saying, well, it's better healthcare, reduces genetic qualifications. And that certainly is a very real possibility. So again, I do not want to disregard the positive aspects of this. And maybe I should put it this way. The tools are not evil. The tools are not harmful. It's how they're used. And so if we are creatures of free will, we're now stepping into a new terrain of complexity and scale, where the consequences of using the tools for a positive or perhaps negative outcome, that's the threshold right now. And we've never seen a evolutionary event horizon of this scale in the history that we know of in this world. And that's hopefully the point I was trying to make. Okay, but one of the areas that I find particularly interesting, and I have a bunch of friends and acquaintances who are part of this, by the way, it's something called the transhumanist movement. And this is where existence sovereignty really begins to step into a different territory, because it's considered realistic science, and I, to a certain degree, agree with this. Yes, some people will be able to live much longer. They'll certainly have genetically magnified presence. They'll have various attributes, be it intelligence, appearance, physiological characteristics, et cetera, all prescribable on a menu of options. Will this be distributed to everybody? No, of course not. As Gibson said, it will not be evenly distributed. So what's the distribution demographic of that? I would suggest it's probably going to be fairly narrow. I mean, if we're going to have 9.5 billion people on this planet within a handful of years, no, not all 9.5 billion are going to have anything close to this. It might be a very tiny, I mean, people talk about the 1% now, the people at the top end of the economic pyramid. This is a different kind of economic pyramid. In my humble opinion, it's not how much stuff do you own or how the size of your bank account, it's access to this. This is where the landed gentry, if you will, of the future really will be. Okay, so a bit about quantum computing, and again, this is a very complex topic, and I'm just going to very briefly sort of touch on it. The whole idea is that in traditional computing, you have ones and zeros as your logical equivalents in your data. In quantum computing, you can have a 1 or a 0 or a 1 and a 0 at the same time. And without going into a whole bunch of stuff about entanglement and how this actually works, I'm just going to suggest to you that in the same amount of data space, they get a certain number of logical possibilities. That amount of logical possibilities in terms of bits of data versus qubits of potential data is an exponentially increasing volume of data that can be processed within the same relative data space. So as these systems come online, and there's already a couple of companies doing this, D-Wave is perhaps the most well-known. One of my favorites actually is a company called Rigotti Computing. They're in Berkeley. And what makes these things interesting is not just is it possible, but more importantly is the software able to connect to, so the outside world can actually communicate with these systems and make effective use of them in a cloud architecture. And that's exactly where things are going now. In fact, you can go onto IBM's website, and they have a 5-qubit quantum computing interface that anybody can, kids can go on there and play around and sort of design their own, sort of custom algorithms using quantum logic. This is already there. Anybody can go have a look at this. This is happening very quickly. Within 5-7 years max, this will become the new norm, as it were. Okay, so again, just to get this point across, once we step across this threshold, all the limitations that were once seen as the barrier point between some kind of ubiquitous computing realm that we're all going to be immersed into, this is going to happen. And this is part of the mechanism that makes it possible. And this, by the way, this thing in the background, that's actually, there's something called in silico biology, which is the idea is you model complex physiological systems and then try to determine the characteristics after you put a change in there, including genetic change. So again, silico biology is one of the most challenging, the far edge of supercomputing. In fact, if you go to most of your big genomics companies now, the vast majority of their intellectual property is not in physical chemistry, it's in their proprietary computing algorithms. And as quantum computing combines with ever more robust AI specialized in this territory, this is exactly where it's going to go. And just in the area of chemistry, this is an example. Protein chemistry is extremely constant, one of the most challenging areas of chemistry. And the whole idea is you can now synthesize an entire protein as opposed to just one little portion of it. Okay, but the next thing I want to talk about, if I have time, in fact, I have only a minute and a half. Well, we have to get as far as we can. So there's this idea of what's called artificial telepathy. And Mark Zuckerberg made this very famous statement about a year ago saying the next big thing in the business world is going to be artificial telepathy. Will your thoughts extend outward into this cloud, and is it a bidirectional process? So here's Nissan, car people, with a direct mind machine interface to a car, so you can think your thoughts to steer the car around. Now, of course, this has been around for quite a few years. Both the US Air Force and also the former Soviet Union have been working on this for fighter pilots in high-performance aircraft. At that time, the technology was still somewhat crude, so it wasn't really practical in that context, but fast forward 20 plus years, now it's become a commoditized item. NeuroSky is just one of many companies. I just happen to have some of their hardware in hand. But again, this is stuff off the shelf. Many of our major game developers now have direct neural interface for game systems. The world's first ever mind-to-mind interface over the internet happened well over a year ago. In other words, people's brains could interact directly without any sort of interaction whatsoever except their thoughts. So this is very quickly becoming a new template. So I'm going to play this one last thing. The idea that you can store all of your experiences and then play them back out. Again, this is a theoretical or science fiction idea. No, not so fast. This is the real thing. This is using fMRI camera system. So people were brought into this lab at UC Berkeley. They were shown a series of video clips, and then using the fMRI system and various algorithms using FFT and other processing mechanisms, they could play back essentially the experience they had just seen through the videos. So have a look at this. And this is several years ago. The resolution is actually much better. This is from about 4 or 5 years ago. But again, what you're seeing is the videos that the test people were exposed to versus what was then extracted from their brain and played back. Now, as it turns out, there was even an attempt to use this in court. I think it was in Michigan. There was a murder trial, and the idea was, could they prove the person saw the body on the ground next to the car, that sort of thing. And for various reasons, it was decided it was too experimental of a technology to be allowed in court. But in India, it actually has been used in court. So in other words, can they prove a person was part of a crime scene or part of something else as evidentiary content? And this actually has happened. So now, one other thing to look at, perhaps, is this. And Toronto, by the way, is where D-Wave, the first commercially available quantum computing system, happens to be located as well. Okay, so I don't know how soon they're going to throw me off the stage, but I'll keep going until they tell me to go off. So again, this whole idea of this sort of meta-scale internet everything, if it's not connected, it's not real, and a sort of biomorphic processing connected to AI systems that we're all now immersed in. This is the territory I'm hoping to highlight here. But the other thing I might touch on just very briefly is this idea of blockchain technology. I'm guessing some of you may know about blockchain, or at least you've heard of cryptocurrencies, I'm guessing, you know, Bitcoin, that sort of thing. Okay, to me, the coins are not that relevant, although it is fascinating to have a decentralized banking system, and since we talk about fiat currencies and so forth, this is the next thing to maybe get away from the sort of negative aspects of these sort of fiat currency systems we have now. But to me, it's not even so much about the coins. It's about the blockchain architecture that allows you to have process deliverables that are in a peer-to-peer network, that have an open ledger that can verify and justify the transfer of different kinds of process domains in real time of these networks. And again, I'll explain much more about this after I'm done with my talk, but I just want to show this is another piece of this emerging puzzle. So, of course, we've all seen this implant chip. Verichip idea was actually called a digital angel, I'm sorry, when it first came out. And for various reasons, people resisted this idea, you know, mark of the beast, et cetera. Okay, fine. Well, even though it's used in some contexts, actually used in animals and pets and so forth, and in some cases, some human populations. But the idea is to sort of remake it a more acceptable idea, so it wouldn't quite cross into the evil, you know, mark of the beast territory. Okay, fine. So how to make this concept more fashionable? And here we go. So this is an example. Okay, I think my moment of demise has approached, but I was just going to very quickly blast through a couple of slides and just to show you kind of where things are going. This is Google Glass, of course, augmented reality. This is going to become, we don't have any more time at all? No? Yes, maybe? Go take one more minute. Okay, so this is an example of how augmented reality will play into the general public, not too distant future. There's no sound though.
Great. Nice. Great.
Vas tarde. Apúrate si quieres una buena calificación.
Voy lo más rápido que puedo.
¿Has pensado en correr? Es saludable y eficiente.
Seguro que no hay más trabajos disponibles. Yo estudié para ser profesora y estoy haciendo mercados.
Y además puedes quedarte con los puntos de fidelización. Eres una afortunada. Tienes que confiar en la aplicación. ¿Te sientes inspirada? Gracias. Chao.
Okay, enough of that. It's a long film, but she goes through the store and has all these adventures. This is actually an implant device with interchangeable smart contact lenses. Remember the first video you saw with the smart contacts? Well, here they are. We don't have time for this, but I just want to show you, here's the last couple of slides. If I had to compress this all into like a sound bite or a visual bite, this is kind of how I see it. This is one template, and then on top of that, I would place this other template, and the two sort of fit together. And I'll leave you with this as the closing slide, and thank you so much for your time and attention.
All right. All right. So Charles Ostman, sir, without a doubt, one of the most fascinating gentlemen I've met recently. And, you know, I think that if there's a takeaway from what he's shared with us, first of all, certainly we could have allotted a lot more time because well, I'll just tell you this. In Koine Greek, the word teknos, Teknos, is actually associated with witchcraft. So what you said at the beginning of your remarks, that we are moving into a time where technology appears magical, is certainly true. So let's have one more round of applause for Charles Ostman. And I'm going to use that to segue into our final guest in the main room for today.